Hey everybody, Howard Tiersky. Welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customers livecast. Today we're going to talk about a really important topic, which is corporate culture. Something that I think a lot of people recognize is really important, but can also seem a little bit abstract. And what I want to offer you today is a model that we're using with clients to help make it very concrete and straightforward to say what really is corporate culture instead of this sort of ephemeral, airy-fairy thing. What is it? It's three key things, and we're going to tell you what they are. And then what are the ways you influence a corporate culture? Because sometimes if you're sitting there in a large company and you say, well, we have some kind of a culture, it may not be quite what we want, but what do I do about it? How do I change the corporate culture? I'm going to give you the 4 key areas that you can focus on to impact your corporate culture that are very, very clear and practical. And so not philosophical or high level. So that's what we're going to cover today in the next 20, 30 minutes. Once again, welcome. So, the importance of corporate culture is something that I hear seemingly everywhere I go, podcasts and books. And, there's that book that came out a few years ago, Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch, implying that, even if you don't have the right strategy, if you have the right corporate culture, that's going to drive your company to success. And, of course, even if you have a great strategy, if your corporate culture isn't good, then potentially you're not going to be able to be successful. So that might be a little bit too black and white. But, there are a lot of studies that support also this idea that corporate culture, again, which we're going to talk about really what the heck that is, because to me, it's a little bit of a buzzword, but corporate culture is important in a lot of components of successful businesses. For example, there was a study that was done that said that 77% of job seekers research a company's culture before applying for a job. And by the way, that same study said that 15% of job seekers reported having declined a job due to the culture of the company that they were being offered a job to go into. And over half of job seekers say they value corporate culture more than money. So if someone's got two job offers, one's a little more money, but one's a culture that the prospective employee feels is better, that over half will say they go with the one with the better culture instead of the one with the better money. So that's a significant, cash register item, right? If that has an impact on your recruiting and also on what you have to pay people to come work at your company. Furthermore, employees who don't like their corporate culture are 24% more likely to quit, according to another study. And a Deloitte survey of top CXOs at large enterprises globally said that 82% of them, essentially nearly all, agree that culture is an important competitive advantage. So a lot of data points that tell us that this is something that really needs to be looked at and thought about as an important business strategy issue, not just a kind of a secondary, ask HR to have a nice holiday Christmas party and hopefully that'll help our corporate culture, but rather something that needs to be looked at almost side by side with business strategy to say this is a key, according to Deloitte, a key competitive advantage for our company. But having said all that, what actually is, I'm going to ask like a crazy question, but what is corporate culture? I mean, let me put it this way. I think we all know what finance is, right? It's things like your accounting, accounts receivable, accounts payable, budgets, forecasting. I think we all know what marketing is, right? It's advertising, branding, slogans, having events, coupons, right? I mean, of course, depending on your business, marketing can be a lot of different things, but it's pretty tangible. It's not hard to say, well, what are a bunch of activities that make up marketing? What is marketing, right? If we say, well, what is customer service? Well, again, it can depend on the company, but it's probably things like your call centers, chat, training your employees to interact better with your customers. So these things are very concrete. But when we talk about culture, what is culture? And even who's in charge of it? Well, I'm going to try to speak in a very plain way about this because I think this is one of those topics that can get too erudite and conceptual and theoretical. And when it does, it becomes not actionable. So I'm going to say to you that culture, another word for culture, is just personality. What's the personality of your company? Now, you might say, okay, Howard, you've just replaced one word with another. What is personality? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that really there are 3 things. And I think having a model like I'm about to share with you is very helpful because instead of thinking about it as this abstract item, you can start to get specific on what it is. Personality is mostly about values. What's important to you? And that is, in what I would say loosely, three main categories. Now, by the way, there's an old quote from my old days working at the Ernst & Young Accelerated Solutions environment they used to have on a wall that said, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I would say that's going to be true here too, right? I'm giving you a model which I think is super useful. I'm not going to suggest that you can't find any exceptions to it. But fundamentally, if you really want to get at the heart of what culture is, it's three key decisions for any given group that culture covers, whether it's the culture of a company, an indigenous tribe, or a country. These are the three key ideas. The first is, what is right? What is really right and wrong? In other words, is the most important thing to make money? Is the most important thing to take care of each other? Is the most important thing fairness? There are different values that different people can have and different companies can have about what is right and what is wrong. We're seeing all these Facebook hearings at the moment about their decisions that they've had to make lately on learning about Instagram and the harm it was doing to teenagers, and not to try to get in the middle of that issue. But clearly a lot of what they had to deal with is thinking about, well, what is really right? Because you have multiple choices when you're a company. I mean, after all, serving your shareholders is part of your obligation. That's what's presumably part of what's right, making money, and at the same time, serving your customers, not harming people. And how do you resolve those conflicts? So that's the first side of the triangle. What is right? And different cultures, of course, if we think through history, right, what was right in the Roman Empire is clearly different from what's right in New York City today, and that may be very different from what's perceived as right in Saudi Arabia right now. So this first leg of the stool, what is right for this group that this culture covers? The second is, what is fun or beautiful or aesthetic, right? You could substitute different things, but what do we believe is really, what is beauty? What is fun? And so that relates to things like how you dress, how you choose to design your office space, things like that, right? So what kinds of activities you engage in. And again, if we start by thinking about culture from a national perspective, and sometimes it's easier to start there because obviously, that's where we get the idea of a corporate culture from the idea of a culture of a tribe or of a country or of an indigenous area. And obviously, if you go to one country, if you go to you may see very different activities, very different attire, a very different way that architecture is built, very different style of art. It's a different sense that represents that culture of what is fun, what isn't beautiful, what is aesthetic. So that's all kind of one. I've piled a few things together here because I think they're all kind of interrelated. What gives us happiness and joy? Maybe that's another way of putting it in terms of what we like to look at and see or do. And then the last is, what is meaningful? What's it all about? Why are we here? Why are we doing what we do in the first place? So there's the three parts. And so I think one of the things that you need to do for any company is be able to answer these questions and say, okay, well, for our company, what is right? What are our morals, ethics, et cetera, that we follow? What is our look? Obviously some environments are very buttoned down, wood paneled, with people wearing three-piece suits and such. And others are very casual with slides going from floor to floor and everyone walking around in shorts and biker shirts or whatever else on, right? So these are easy to see if you look around different corporate cultures as important differences and still meaningful. So actually, let's go through each of those three just a little bit more depth. I've kind of feel like I've already talked about this one, what is right? But it goes to things like, what happens when we get into a contract dispute? How do we deal with that other company? Do we try to screw them? Is what is right to always try to get an advantage over another company? Or is what is right to respect that other company and develop long-term partnerships? I think one way of thinking about this is it's always about, what do you do when there's a conflict? Because you don't need to go to your code of morals or ethics when it's obvious what to do, right? If a customer walks into your store and says, here's $50, I want to buy, your product. Take the money, you give them the product. You don't really need a code of ethics of what to do in that situation. But when you have a conflict, when you have a challenge, you have a choice to make. where one side may be in the more financial interest of the company or the strategic interest of the company, and the other might go to some more underlying ethical issue. That's really where this leg of the stool comes into play. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how you bring these to life. The first thing is to be clear, what is the company's set of values, set of ethical codes, et cetera. You could argue these are all values, by the way. What is right, what is fun, what is meaningful are all different kinds of values. Values about a look of something, or values about ethics, or values about purpose. But in any case, the first is getting clear on what it is. I'm going to talk in a minute about how you bring this to life in a way that people see it and it actually becomes part of their experience of the company. And so what is fun or what is beautiful? You can imagine, just in this little picture here, you can get a sense of a corporate culture when people have their hardwood floors and are racing, doing rolling desk chair races through the halls. This would not be considered fun, beautiful, acceptable behavior in probably some law firms, right? And a tech company, maybe it would. But you know what? Maybe there are law firms where that is what they do. And maybe there are tech companies, I know there are tech companies where you wouldn't do this, where this would be considered bad behavior. This would be considered inappropriate in the office. So not every company matches the cliche, if you will, cultural cliche of their industry. But things like your logo, the colors you paint your office space, how you have fun, how you ask people to dress. So we've kind of talked about that already. Those are the components that define your company's sense of what is fun and beautiful. And the last is what gets you out of bed in the morning? What is meaningful, or put it another way, what is the purpose? Why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? So we're going to give you some examples of that in a minute, because it's going to intersect with the 4 ways in which you actually bring these things to life. So you're going to see some more examples of these 3 things in the 4 ways to bring them to life, which I'm going to get to in a minute. But first, I just want to make this point. So why is this helpful? Why do we need this in business? I mean, you could argue, listen, what does it matter if you dress differently than me, right? If you have a different ethical code than me, can't we be in business together? Why do we all have to have the same purpose when we show up to work? Well, we don't all have to have the same purpose, but there are some real benefits to having a company that really stands for something concrete with respect to these 3 areas, with respect to its overall culture and personality, versus one that doesn't, where you just have diversity. Now, you might say, isn't diversity good? Obviously, there are many types of diversity that are great. We want ethnic diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, age diversity, absolutely. But when you have more commonality of culture, that can give you some key business benefits. So what are those? Well, the first is that often people who have shared values are able to work together with less friction, more rapidly come to agreements together, better able to bond and build relationships with each other, and therefore work more effectively together. Now, again, that's not exclusively true. I'm not saying people who have different values can't do that, but if you look on average at people, if I was going to bring together 10 people and say it's really critical that these 10 people be able to work really effectively together, would you rather have a group of people that kind of think similarly, that have a sort of similar ideas about what's fun, similar ideas about their purpose and why they're there together, and similar sense of ethical values? I think my view is they're going to work better together. Now, they can still have all kinds of diversity. They may have different skills, background, experience, age, many, many areas of diversity. But in this area of cultural uniformity, or at least more commonality, often yields to people working better together. The second is, this also can reflect well in terms of who you're trying to attract as a customer. When you as a company stand for certain things from an ethical perspective, you have a certain kind of look and a certain kind of, personality, a certain style, and, a certain reason for existence. Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. Why you do what you do is more important than what you do, not just internally, but in terms of how your customers perceive it. So if you're all over the place and you don't have a consistent culture, then you're not attracting a particular type of customer. But when you internally have these things with some degree of commonality, then that can also be felt by the customer. Every time I walk into a Starbucks, I feel a certain kind of vibe from the people who work there. There's a certain common culture in Starbucks. And if I'm attracted to that vibe, then I'm attracted to Starbucks. Whereas there's other stores that I walk into where, it depends on who's there. There's not going to be a common vibe when I walk into, some other kind of store. So that's the second reason. which is it can influence customers by creating that sort of sense of what your company stands for. The third is tribalism. Now, of course, in our culture today, we see a lot of negative consequences of tribalism, and there are. But it's also true. And what is tribalism? Very simply, tribalism is just us versus them, right? We're the cool kids, they're the geeks. We're the innovative people, they're the old fuddy-duddies. We're the people who care about customers, they're the ones who do whatever they want. You know, we're the sophisticated Ivy League educated ones, and they're the less educated, commoners, right? Whatever it may be. I guess I'm giving you these examples to show it doesn't have to be any one thing, but when a group feels like they have something in common and it separates them from the others, for example, their competitors, that can also be positive in terms of the group's cohesion. As I mentioned, there are possibly some negative societal consequences, but in terms of on a very practical level, what is it that having a strong culture does for you, having a common sense of what's right, what's fun, and what's meaningful? It gives you those three benefits. When you achieve it, you attract people who have shared common values, and that makes them work better together. You attract customers more because there's a sense of you really stand for something. And thirdly, you create a sense of tribalism, which makes it harder for people to leave and keeps people together. But I just really want to make this point that there is no one right answer. It's not that this culture is better than that culture. Standing for this is better than standing for that. Of course, there may be some cultures that are more effective than others. A culture that says we hate our customers may not lead to an effective product and an effective business. So I'm not saying there are no wrong answers, but I'm saying there are many right answers. And a law firm that's a really cool downtown vibe with hardwood floors and everyone dresses casually may be just as successful as a law firm which has an uptown office with wood paneled walls and everyone wears a three-piece suit. But it's a different personality, right? And so no right or wrong, but there's quite a range of possible personalities. So let's talk about how you get there, right? Hopefully I've given you an understanding of at least my view on a very practical level, what defines a culture, what's right, what's fun, what's meaningful, shared values. But how do you get there? There's a quote from Emerson, which is, every great institution is the lengthened shadow of a single man. A little misogynistic there, but we'll give him a pass considering the era in which he lived. His character determines the character of the organization. Now, I think we do see some of this in action. When a founder starts a new company and hires the first three people, and they have a set of shared values, and then that perpetuates. But some companies today have become thousands and thousands or even tens of thousands of people, and there's a certain shared set of values that came from the original founder. I'm going to give you some examples of that in a minute. Well, that's cool, but I'm guessing most people listening are going to say, yeah, but I work for large bank X or large retailer X. Like, that was a long time ago, and it's too late. The cat is out of the bag. Maybe you don't have a well-defined, effective corporate culture, or at least you're not where you want to be, and it's too late to go back to the beginning and more effectively change it from the founder. So what do you do when you want to shift or solidify or clarify or strengthen a corporate culture? Well, let's talk about that. The first thing, as I said earlier, is you have to decide on the answers. For our company, what is right? What is fun? What is meaningful? One of the challenges can be, well, how do you answer that question? If our company is 30,000 people and they all have a different view on these things, what is the company? Because, of course, companies really can't have values. Only people can have values. Culture is about shared values amongst the people at the company, not the actual company. I mean, companies don't really exist except as a sort of a legal construct on paper, as a brand. So one way is to start to get a sense of what are the more common values within your organization. At a certain point, if you shift from a culture which is weak to a culture which is strong, you probably want to pick cultural characteristics that are widely shared, but they're probably not going to be shared by everybody, because when you have a weak culture, you attract people with a lot of different personalities and people with a lot of different kind of cultural orientations. And I don't mean that in a ethnic or nationalistic cultural sense. I mean in terms of corporate culture. As soon as you start to make it stronger, some people will be more excited to work there, and some people will be less excited because that culture that you've strengthened isn't aligned with what their actual set of values are. So know that as you move towards a stronger culture, what winds up happening over time is you lose some people who you're turning off, but you strengthen other people who are excited by the increased power of the culture. And then you start to attract new people that are more consistent culturally, because they're there because they like to be there. Just imagine going to work for Google. There are some people who would say, I would love to work for Google. It seems like such a cool place. And there are other people who might say, I would never want to work for Google. When I hear about what it's like working there and what the people do and how they behave and how they act and how they dress, that's totally not me. I wouldn't fit in there. Great. That's what you want. That's what it is to have a strong culture. You attract the people who quote unquote fit in. So, okay, that's what you need to do first. But just because you got in a conference room and whiteboarded out your what is right, what is fun, what is meaningful for your company doesn't mean you have a stronger culture. All you have is a kind of a blueprint for a stronger culture. You haven't actually built that culture yet. So let's talk about how you do that. How do you go from a conceptual culture where you've defined what you want it to be to actually putting it into action? So I promised you 4 concrete things you can do to make your culture active within your organization. So here's what they are, and we're going to walk through them. Symbols and phrases, stories and artifacts, rituals, and rules and consequences. Now, I'm going to go through each of these one at a time. If it all seems kind of abstract, hopefully in the next 5 or 7 minutes, it won't be abstract at all. Symbols and phrases that reflect your culture, right? If you think about, Christianity has certain symbols. An African native tribe may have other symbols, right? Or certain phrases. Stories and artifacts, things like your origin story, and could be objects as well. And I'm going to talk about these in more details. Rituals, things that you do regularly that reinforce the culture, and also rules and consequences that heavily go to this issue of what is right, but not only. And what we're going to be doing then is we're going to be seeing the intersection between how these fundamental qualities, these decisions, these values of your culture about what is right, what is fun, and what is meaningful will then be expressed and experienced through these 4 lenses, through symbols and phrases, through stories and artifacts, through rituals, and through rules and consequences. If this all sounds like you've just walked into Sociology 101 or something, stay with me, because my commitment to you is in the next few minutes that this won't be abstract, but it'll be very clear. So at Google, let's talk about symbols and phrases, first of all. Google was founded, or shortly after their founding, partly on this phrase, don't be evil. Everybody at Google knows this phrase, don't be evil. And here at Google, they have it up on the wall, at least at one point. They had it up on the wall as whatever those are, metal letters, things like that. So this is a phrase that is not their tagline. It's not necessarily their branding. It's an internal phrase. And many companies have some kind of phrase that imparts a key component of what the company is all about. And clearly, in part, this particular phrase relates to what is right? But it could also, Google also has other phrases like to connect all the information in the world or something like that. And that could relate more to what is meaningful. What is our purpose? Why are we here? So companies can have a few phrases like Google does, which help, are repeated regularly, which help to bring to life through language, and in this case, through sculpture or whatever you want to call that, that particular aspect of the brand. Let's look at another one, the Marines. Certainly in the military, we see the strong use of culture to keep people together, to make people loyal, to motivate people to behave in extreme ways, frankly, to even put their life on the line. So the Marines, for example, have this symbol and this phrase, Semper Fidelis. What does that mean? It means always faithful, or Semper Fi, it's sometimes abbreviated as. And you ask any Marine, they'll tell you Semper Fi. In fact, many Marines tattoo this on their arms. This phrase is so important to their culture. And this idea of always being faithful, it's not just words, it's a key value, it's a key purpose of what it means to be a Marine. Microsoft had this phrase, a computer on every desk and in every home. Of course, that was a long time ago. They have other phrases now because they've essentially accomplished that phrase. But when Microsoft is founded, clarity on what is our purpose? Why are we here? So you can see hopefully how these phrases connect not only to it's not only about what is right. It can be about what is right. It can be about what is our purpose. In fact, the style of the phrase can even relate to what is fun, what is beautiful, etc. Another way of using language and phrases are the labels you give to the people who work there. Amazon workers at Amazons are referred to as Amazonians. Google employees are referred to as Googlers. Twitter employees, I think they use tweeps, and at Accenture they call it Accenturians, I think it is. So, this idea, and you can see some of the tribalism in there, right? You can see some language that's helping represent that we are different. There's a different identity of those of us at this company. Why? Because we share some common values. So that was the first category, phrases and symbols. I've covered a lot more phrases than I have symbols, but here's a symbol, and this is actually going to dovetail a little bit into our second category as well, which is stories and artifacts. So another way of creating a sense of what the personality of the company is based on what you stand for and what you care about and what your purpose is, things like that, are stories. And those can be many different types of stories, but one of the most powerful is the origin story. So many people at Amazon or people outside of Amazon know the story of Jeff Bezos driving across the country, leaving his job at, I think it was Goldman Sachs, driving across the country with his girlfriend at the time, establishing Amazon and doing it in such a frugal way. The story goes that they didn't want to buy a desk for him. It was cheaper to go to Home Depot and buy a door because the doors, I guess, were on sale, and then buy some 2x4s or something and connect them. And so his desk was, and I believe to this day still is, a door. That's what that is in the picture, held up by some lumber rather than spending the money to buy the desk. The point being, you can be resourceful, you can save money, you can do things, with some ingenuity and save and be more inexpensive. And that story now, if you know people at Amazon, you know that there are thousands of people at Amazon that have desks made from doors, even though Amazon has plenty of money now to buy them a regular desk, because this is a story. It's also a symbol. This desk is a symbol of who we are at Amazon and what is it all about and what are our shared values. The desk is a symbol and it connects back to a story. And I guess you could argue that the original desk, wherever that may be, is an artifact. And that's what we mean when we say artifacts, right? Something like, this is the original desk. This is the light bulb that Thomas Edison first created, that sort of thing. And Jeff Bezos' original desk probably has some posts and ropes around it somewhere in some Amazon lobby, I don't know. So this idea of shared memories, it could also, by the way, be sacred texts. If you think many religions, many cultures have some kind of a sacred text, whether it's the Bible or the Quran, or not in a secular sense. Look at us here in the United States. We have the Declaration of Independence. We have the Constitution, right? These contain within them, of course, some phrases that are important to us in our American culture, like we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, right? Things like that become part of our culture. But sacred texts can also be part of a company. Let's look, for example, at the famous Microsoft memo that Bill Gates wrote back in 1995 on the internet tidal wave, where he essentially communicated to the whole company, we need to rethink everything we do because the internet is going to be huge. And that memo is now, as part of the, if you will, the sacred texts of Microsoft's history. So those are some examples of stories, artifacts, and sacred texts. Let's go to the third category. The third category is rules and consequences. So you can see how this ties heavily to this idea of right and wrong. You need to be able to have that sense of right and wrong manifest in rules. How do we operate here? If someone has a dispute with their supervisor, what happens then? If someone steals office supplies, what happens then? If we have a customer that wants to return something after the 30-day window has expired, what happens then, right? These are rules and consequences. What happens when the rule is violated? Or what happens when the rule is met? And one of the things that's important is to reflect that rules aren't only negative. Rules aren't only things you break. They are also the rules for rewards. How do we decide who gets promoted? How do we decide who gets a raise? Yes. Also, what do we do when we need to fire somebody? What other kind of honors do we give people to acknowledge and recognize that according to our sense of what is right, this person has done the right thing vis-a-vis our organization? And so one of the things that rules are essentially the visible manifestation and of what is right and what is wrong, which is one of the three cornerstones of defining that culture, those values. And it's important that rules, at least regularly, if not always, be addressed, enforced, or operationalized in a public way, right? This is why in the Marines, for example, you have both promotions and rewards that are done as part of public ceremonies. And this is actually going to connect us to our next topic, which is rituals. But also when people are punished. If you watch old military movies, I don't know if this is how it's done today, but the soldier who doesn't listen to the sergeant winds up standing out in the rain or having to do 5,000 push-ups, and the entire platoon can see that punishment. Because again, it is the operationalization of that sense of right and wrong that is visible. And this is how you create a culture, through rules and consequences, both positive and negative, that connect back to that sense of what is right and what is wrong. Okay. So going into our fourth category, the fourth category, if you recall, of how you operationalize culture is through rituals. Rituals are activities which are repeated for some specific reason at some interval. In other words, they can be things like holidays. We have an annual holiday party. This is what we do every year when we pass out the bonus checks. We do it in a certain way. It's a certain way of doing things. It's not just having a holiday party. It's how you do it. It's for example, there's a certain way that the Marines do their promotion ceremonies. It's known, it's repeated in the same way. It's a tradition. And those traditions need to reflect your sense of what is beautiful, your sense of what our purpose is, your sense of what is right and what is wrong. It's an opportunity to construct rituals that actually reflect those underlying components, the values of the culture. This can be things like, how do you onboard a new employee? There are some environments in which a new employee is taken out to lunch by everybody and given a mentor, et cetera. And there are other places where people play practical jokes on the new employee as a way of making them feel like they're part of the gang. And again, not to judge one versus the other. I'm sure there are pros and cons of both, but these are rituals. My daughter, Rachel, goes to Dartmouth now. She's a junior, and they have a ritual there that every year there's a certain day in the fall when they light a giant bonfire in the quad, and all of the freshmen are brought in and they're brought around the bonfire, and there's a particular thing that they do, and it's something that they've been doing for, 285 years or however many years it's been that Dartmouth has been doing this tradition. And when you go and you participate in that tradition, you really feel like you're part of something. There's tribalism there. You have participated in a special ritual that's only for people that are part of this club, this people who go to this particular school. So anyway, those are some examples of rituals. You could have rituals for, like I said, certain holidays, or what's the ritual when someone makes a sale? At some organizations, every time there's a big sale, they ring a gong or they do something else. The opportunity, this is a great opportunity, by the way, to say to yourself, well, what rituals do you have at your company? And if you don't have any, create some. What form of public, illustration of the application of rules do you have? If you don't have one, create them. This is why I think that this model is so actionable, because you can literally sit there and say, okay, let's do some of these things. I want to end with one last thought, which is the idea of nested cultures. So we've talked about already the basics of a culture, a personality, a set of shared values as being what is right, what is fun, and what is meaningful. And we've quickly gone through 4 ways that you can bring them to life: through symbols and phrases, like putting on the wall Google's "What is evil," through rituals, like the way you do your promotion ceremony, through rules and consequences, and through artifacts and stories and artifacts, sorry about that, such as the Amazon origin story, et cetera, including things like sacred texts. So those are the ways you can bring things to life. But one thing I want to point out, and sometimes when I talk about culture, I get a question. Someone says, well, wait a minute, the military has a culture, but then the Marines kind of have their own culture, right? And then, within the Marines, certain special forces groups, they may have their own subculture. And this can happen in companies too. You can have a company culture, but certain different divisions have a certain culture. There's a culture in the call center. You may have a skunk works group that has a different kind of culture. So, is this good or is this bad or what? And I think the answer is that it's fine, that this is natural, that cultures nest. We have a US culture of sorts, for sure, that's very different from the culture of, say, China. And at the same time, there's a different culture in New York, where I live, than there is in Memphis, and probably yet a different culture, for sure, in San Francisco. And so I think the important thing is that it not be highly contradictory. You can have some higher level values about what is right and what is fun and what is meaningful. If you look at the values of the most narrow Marine Special Forces unit, they're not against Semper Fi, right? They're not violating the overarching rules or the overarching personality or culture of the Marines, but they're just even a narrower group. And I think as long as your nested cultures fit well within the larger culture, it's not contradictory, then I don't think you have an issue. And I would add further that sometimes companies intentionally create nested cultures which are contradictory. For example, a company that's very sort of old-fashioned and slow-moving that decides to create a subgroup that's going to be the opposite, so they can be innovative within a group. And when that happens, you can get some benefits because you're creating a different culture that's meant to have different pros and cons, but you typically also get conflict. And so maybe that's okay. Maybe you're weighing one against the other, but know that from a cultural perspective, this goes against the goal of having a unified culture. But of course, culture is only one part of looking at an overall successful business. And so there are times when you may strategically choose to have a conflicting culture within one nested group because it meets a greater need. So I'm not necessarily saying never do it, but be mindful of the fact that if you're creating, if you will, what I would call a culture architecture, where you have some different groups with different cultures, you're going to have more of the benefits that I talked about earlier, the ability to work together more effectively, a sense of tribalism, and something that's going to be more attractive to customers when those nested cultures are aligned and are simply narrower and narrower versions. Just like I can have a tree, and then I can have, a kind pine tree, and then I can have a type of pine tree. They're all consistent, but they're just more and more specific versions of a broader idea. So that's what I wanted to say about nested cultures. Certainly, this is a topic that is deep and rich. There are hundreds and hundreds of books written about it. I haven't necessarily drawn this from any one particular book or source, but just from my own experience and the work that we do with clients. Would love to know what you think. My goal is always to try to simplify things down to actionable models. And I'm curious if you feel these models are complete, or if you see something that's really important that's missing. There's always something secondary that's missing because we're trying to put high level, simple, easy to understand and remember models. But would love your comments, would love your thoughts. As always, thanks so much for watching the Winning Digital Customers livecast. Until next time, keep transforming. And that includes your